those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Barney Forsyth, and I'm the president of Westminster College. And it's a delight for me, on behalf of the entire Westminster College community, to welcome you this evening to our second C.S. Lewis Legacy Lecture of the day by our most prestigious speaker, Dr. Michael Ward from Oxford University. C.S. Lewis described our task as educators to irrigate deserts, not cut down jungles. And our C.S. Lewis lecture fulfills that goal, giving us new ideas and new viewpoints that quench our thirst for knowledge, that enliven our imagination and help us make meaning of the world and help us all to grow as people. I want to say another special thanks to Jim and Sharon Herod with us tonight, who make this lecture series possible. Jim and Sharon, thank you. They initiated this lecture series and the new professorship that accompanies it because they wanted to give back to Westminster College and make a difference in the lives of our students and our community, and we are very grateful for their generosity. At the morning lecture today, we learned a little bit about the life and philosophy of C.S. Lewis, and particularly about the relationship between reason and imagination. And tonight our lecturer will concentrate on the world of C.S. Lewis, the world that he created through imagination, through the Tales of Narnia. In the seventh and last volume of the Chronicles of Narnia, entitled The Last Battle, the Unicorn Jewels speaks for all the characters when he says, "I belong here. This is the land that I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it until now. Come further up. Come further in." And today, Dr. Ward is going to take us on that journey, further up and further into the world of Narnia, as envisioned by the imagination of C.S. Lewis. And I know I speak for all of us here tonight when I say we can hardly wait to be carried on this journey. I'd like to invite Dr. Cliff Kane, our Herod C.S. Lewis Professor of Religious Studies, now to introduce tonight's speaker. Cliff.
Thank you. It really is an impossible task to provide an adequate introduction of our speaker. I can't do it in a few words, and after all, the bulk of the time ought to be reserved for the lecture and not for the introduction. So, I will share a designedly, intentionally inadequate introduction. And here it goes. Surely one of the striking things about the literature of C.S. Lewis is its incredible breadth. Surely one of the striking things about reading the literature written by C.S. Lewis is its creativity, its fantasy, its challenges, its way of hooking the reader. What stimulated the imagination of C.S. Lewis? What, if anything, served as a springboard for the writing of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia? Is there anything that grants some coherence to what sometimes appears to be disorganization in these writings of Lewis? What's the Rosetta Stone that will unlock the mysteries of the hieroglyphics? Some have suggested that the Chronicles of Narnia are based on the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. Some have conjured that they're based on the unifying theme of the 7 cardinal virtues. Some have proposed that they are based on the 7 deadly sins. Some have pondered that they're based on Edmund Spenser's poem, The Faerie Queen, one of C.S. Lewis's favorite pieces of poetry. our speaker brings another possibility, another suggestion, one that has been heralded as one of the most significant contributions to C.S. Lewis studies in the past 5 decades. This contribution can help us to understand better the genius, the complexity, the faith, and the intent of Clive Staples Lewis. Dr. Michael Ward is a Roman Catholic layperson, a professor, a scholar, an author, and an actor. Yes, the rumors you heard are true. Michael was in the James Bond movie, The World Is Not Enough. He was the technician who handed the X-ray spectacles to James Bond, as portrayed by Pierce Brosnan. This evening's lecture is entitled Planet Narnia, the Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. Please welcome again to our community, to Westminster College, and now to this podium, Professor Michael Ward. Michael?
Again, welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, President. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on this bitterly cold night. Let me give you something to warm your reason and your imagination. This morning I was talking about reason and imagination in theory in the writings of C.S. Lewis. Tonight we look at how he put his theories into practice. Oh dear, I've suddenly realized I don't have the, I don't see the next picture on my, is there any way of, I should have thought of that. I'll have to just look ahead. Right, okay. Let me begin then by quoting you some words written many thousand years ago, possibly by a king of Israel. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Those are the opening verses of Psalm 19. A psalm which C.S. Lewis described as the greatest poem in the book of Psalms and one of the finest lyrics in the world. Here is Lewis on the cover of Time magazine in the 1940s, just after he published the Screwtape Letters. That's why he's got the devil and the angel either side of his head. But it's not about Screwtape I want to talk to you tonight. It's about the 7 Narnia Chronicles, which I think are the works for which Lewis is easily best known. Can I do a quick survey, actually, and ask you, how many of you here tonight have read at least one of these books or seen at least one of the movies? Thank you. That's 90% success rate, I think. 1 or 2 people may not be familiar with these books, but hopefully tonight's talk may encourage you to go looking at these works if you're not yet familiar with them. Lewis published these books 1 per year from 1950 to 1956. They soon established themselves as very popular. They still sell approximately 3 million copies annually worldwide in over 40 different languages. So they are some of the most influential best-selling works of the second half of the 20th century. And they are indeed very popular, with young and old, with male and female, with educated and less educated, with Christian and non-Christian. But not everybody likes the stories. Famously, when C.S. Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to his great friend Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien hated what he heard. Tolkien couldn't understand why Lewis had written the book the way that he had. He couldn't understand why Lewis should have put English children alongside fauns and centaurs and dryads and naiads, characters from Greek and Roman mythology, alongside a white witch character who seems very much to be based on a snow queen out of a Hans Andersen fairy tale, alongside Father Christmas, for goodness sake. What is he doing in this story? Tolkien thought that this assembling of all sorts of incompatible mythological and literary traditions was a hodgepodge, a mishmash. Tolkien disliked it intensely. And he soon gave up any interest in the books. He didn't read them when Lewis began to publish them. He later confessed that they were entirely outside his range of imaginative sympathy. Lewis, on the other hand, loved Middle-earth, and if it hadn't been for Lewis's constant encouragement, Tolkien would almost certainly, he admits this, almost certainly have not completed writing The Lord of the Rings, or if he had completed it, he wouldn't have offered it for publication, because it was only Lewis who ever convinced Tolkien that there would be an audience for the kind of thing that he was writing. So in a sense, we owe The Lord of the Rings to C.S. Lewis as much as to Tolkien. Lewis loved Middle-earth. Tolkien hated Narnia. They really had a love-hate relationship. But because Tolkien has become so famous, his attitude to Narnia has also become very well known, and lots of people have thought, mistakenly, that Tolkien actually knew the series very well and that he knew what he was talking about when he dismissed the books as a hodgepodge. Actually, he didn't. But lots of people have followed in his wake, and they've also described Narnia as a mishmash, thrown together almost at random. Here are works of a professor at play, works for children, not works of great literature, just fun stories to while away bedtime with your young child before you turn out the lights at night. But that doesn't really account for the huge popularity of the tales now over 5, 6, 7 decades, and their popularity with very educated people as well as young and uneducated children. There must be more going on here than meets the eye. And lots of people have been troubled by the fact that on the surface, yes, Tolkien's criticism has something to say for it. On the surface, yes, the books do seem to be compiled out of disparate mythological traditions. And yet Lewis, we know, was a very rigorous and consistent thinker. He wasn't the sort of person to slop together these stories in 5 minutes one afternoon. His poetry is fantastically complex. Look at his poetry sometime, and your minds will be boggled at how complex his poetry can be. You think you've worked out the rhyme scheme, the meter of one of Lewis's poems. You look a bit more closely, and a whole other dimension of complexity reveals itself beneath the one you first noticed. He said that he was enamored of metrical and phonetic subtleties, and the poems which look as if they're in free verse are often in the most complicated meters of all. As a medieval scholar, too, Lewis loved studying the writings of authors like Dante and Chaucer and Milton, writers, he said, who love to present us with something which can't be taken in at a glance. Everything leads to everything else in these writers, he said, but often by very intricate paths. Intricacy and complexity are marks of the medieval mind, he says. These writers present us with something which at first looks planless, though all is planned. And as a Christian, Lewis believed that the universe itself was a fantastically intricate work of divine artistry. Every single thing in creation, he believed, has been made for a purpose. Down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. It's all there in the mind of God. He knows what he's up to. It's hard for us to work out what that plan might be when we see accidents happen and all sorts of inexplicable events and disasters. But no, God is working his purposes out as year succeeds to year. The divine author knows what he's about in creating this universe. So you put those things together, Lewis's own complex poetry, his own love of complex medieval literature, his own beliefs in divine complex creativity, and then you turn back to the Narnia Chronicles and you ask yourself, can they really be a hodgepodge, a mishmash? It's not so likely. And Lewis scholars, Lewis critics, in attempting to find some sort of coherence, some sort of imaginative design to these 7 stories, have naturally looked to the second level of meaning within the stories, which has to do with the biblical parallels, with the theological themes that run throughout the tales. Because Lewis once said that the whole Narnia series was about Christ. And the Christ character, Aslan, the Lion King, he is the only character who appears in all 7 books, and he is very Christ-like, particularly in these 3 tales. He is the Narnian redeemer in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. He's the Narnian creator in The Magician's Nephew. He's the Narnian judge in The Last Battle. The biblical parallels here are very obvious. You can't miss them. But these are only 3 out of 7 books. What about the other 4? When you turn to these other 4, it's less clear how Aslan relates to Christ. You might have expected Lewis to give us Narnian equivalents of other major elements in Christ's life and ministry. You know, a whole Narnia story, for instance, devoted to Aslan's birth into Narnia as a lion cub. You know, like Jesus is born into Bethlehem as a baby, but you don't get that. You don't get a Narnian ascension story. You don't get a Narnian Pentecost, which you might have expected, given what Lewis has done in these 3. But in these 4, what do you get? You have, Aslan is still present. He's still Christ-like in various ways. But what's he doing in these tales? Nothing very obviously connected to major elements or episodes in the life and ministry of Christ. In Prince Caspian, for instance, Aslan enters the story amongst dancing trees before giving a great war cry. In The Dawn Treader, Aslan's seen flying in a sunbeam. In The Silver Chair, Aslan doesn't actually come down to Narnia at all. He's confined to his own high country above the clouds. And in The Horse and His Boy, he's mistaken for 2 lions, or maybe 3 lions. And he does a great deal of dashing about in that story. You remember he says there was only 1 lion, but he was swift of foot. So why has Lewis chosen to make his Christ character swift of foot? I don't recall Jesus in the Gospels having a special ministry to athletes or, you know, being a notable sprinter. Why would you do that? It's an interesting question. Is this just another aspect of the hodgepodge nature of the books, or is there more going on here? So when we look at the Chronicles from this biblical perspective, trying to find a sense of coherence, unity, pattern and design, complexity, intricacy, we go some way to solving this puzzle, but not very far. And yet we still have this fact that Lewis was so very interested in complexity of all kinds. Literary, theological, artistic complexity. And that is what has led many scholars and critics to, as Cliff said in his introduction, go looking for an additional level of design beneath the obvious biblical parallels and the 7 sacraments, the 7 books of Spencer's Fairy Queen, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 dwarfs. No, only joking about that one. But many of these ideas have been half seriously suggested as to account for these 7 books. I myself once made a half-hearted attempt to link the different chronicles of Lewis to different plays by Shakespeare. But I soon abandoned that idea. You know when you're trying to twist books to fit a grid of your own devising. And this theory didn't get me very far, so I abandoned that. And it was when I wasn't looking for it that I believe I stumbled across the real answer to this imaginative conundrum. I was halfway through my PhD researches at the time. An idea came to me at 11:30 one night, one Wednesday in February, and I'll be telling you about that later on. I took my idea to my PhD supervisors. They said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. You should explore that further." So I did. I finished my PhD. I wrote up my thesis and published it with Oxford University Press as this book. The BBC then got interested and commissioned a documentary about it called The Narnia Code. Please excuse the title. It's got nothing to do with the Da Vinci Code. The Narnia Code is a documentary and now a book. It's a shorter, simpler version of Planet Narnia. And it's the substance of these works that I want to share with you tonight. This aha moment that I had at 11:30 that night in February was quite the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me while holding a book in my hands. It's dominated my life for the last 10 years. Because it really, I believe, solves this mystery. But it's a very big claim that I'm making, that Lewis had an intentional, deliberate design behind the Narnia books that he told nobody about and which nobody noticed for 50, 60 years. Until I came along, you know. I mean, that is a preposterous claim. You might say it's a very arrogant claim. You would be right to be skeptical. I would be skeptical if anybody came to me with such a claim. But hear me out. Listen to the evidence, because once you begin to consider the evidence, it's not so unlikely. In fact, it's very probable, I think. We should not only allow Lewis to do this sort of thing, but really, in a sense, we should expect him to do it. It coheres with so much that we know about his interests and activities. So before I come on to the substance of this argument, let me give you 5 quick background reasons that will hopefully disarm some of your skepticism. And the first of these background reasons has to do with Lewis himself and his own personality, because he could be very secretive when he wanted to be. Jack never ceased to be secretive. That was the verdict of George Sayer, who knew C.S. Lewis for 30 years, both as a pupil and as a friend. Jack never ceased to be secretive. You know that his nickname was Jack. You know, he didn't like Clive Staples. So he was always known as Jack. Jack never ceased to be secretive. And if we're looking for examples of his secretiveness, the most obvious is the fact that when he got married in his late 50s, he kept his marriage secret for the best part of a year. Have you seen the film Shadowlands? Do you know about this part of his life? The whole point of a marriage is that it's a public relationship. But a private marriage is a contradiction in terms. Yet Lewis got married and told nobody about it. Not even close friends like Tolkien. A man who can keep his marriage secret can keep anything secret. But there are plenty of other examples, actually, of his guardedness, his privacy. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many very significant things that one of his friends jokingly said it should not have been entitled Surprised by Joy. It should have been called Suppressed by Jack. So there are lots of ways in which Lewis could be guarded, could compartmentalize his life very much. And of course, this doesn't prove anything about Narnia. I'm not saying that because Lewis had a private marriage, therefore he had a secret to Narnia. I'm just saying this is the kind of man we're dealing with. This is the sort of temperament, this is the psychology of the man. So that's the first background point, Lewis's psychology. Secondly, epistemology. Epistemology is the study of consciousness, how we know things. And Lewis once said that an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. An influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. Let me quickly summarize for you his understanding of consciousness. He divided conscious knowledge into 2 modes, contemplation and enjoyment. And he writes about these in a little article called Meditation in a Tool Shed, where he sees a beam of light slanting down through the darkness of his tool shed one sunny day. It's bright outside, but it's dark inside the shed. And Lewis looks at this beam of light. He sees the particles of dust floating in the sunbeam. It lights up a patch of the floor. This is his image of one kind of consciousness, which he calls contemplation, looking at the beam. This is the sort of knowing that we have of a thing when we are inspecting it from a distance. We are coolly and neutrally detached observers. That's one way in which we know things. Then he shifts his position so that the beam of light is no longer falling on the floor, but is now falling directly on his eyes. And instantly, he said, the whole picture changed. He no longer saw the tool shed. Most significantly, he no longer saw the beam of light, because he now saw along the beam of light. And by looking along it, he saw something quite different. He saw the crack at the top of the door. He saw the leaves on the tree waving in the wind outside. He saw millions of miles away the sun itself. This is his image for the second kind of consciousness, which he calls enjoyment, looking along the beam. And the distinction between these two modes is like the distinction between saber and connaisseur in Spanish, or savoir and connaître in French. Knowledge about something from the outside, knowledge of something from the inside. And Lewis is encouraging his readers really to try out every question that presents itself to us in both modes, insofar as that's possible. He says we should be like the ancient Persians who debated everything twice, once when they were sober and once when they were drunk. There are benefits to our knowledge of being drunk. That is to say, of being disinhibited, of committing yourself. I'm told that when you're drunk, you are able to say things and see things which you're not when you're stone cold sober. In vino veritas, in wine is truth. So when Lewis says an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep, what he means is an influence which can't evade our cold, neutral, detached consciousness won't go very deep. Sometimes we need to commit ourselves if we are to get the deeper kind of knowledge. Not try and be detached and neutral, but actually take a position, step into an experience. I mean, what would you prefer? To read facts about someone on a Wikipedia entry, or to be in a relationship with that person? I suppose it would depend on the person, but but all things being equal, it's better to be in a personal relationship with someone than just to read their biography. You know them much more intimately that way. But the interesting thing is that when you look along the beam vanishes. That's the key point for our present purposes. Because light is not so much something you see as it is something you see by. It's not the object of your vision, it's now the medium of your vision. And there is therefore this inescapable invisibility behind enjoyment consciousness. There is a kind of hiddenness involved in being committed to a thing, because you're not outside it. Okay, so that's our epistemological background point. Now a more theological background point. Lewis was interested in this verse from Colossians. For all things were created through Christ and for Christ, and in Christ all things hold together. Lewis was sufficiently interested in this verse to paraphrase it in one of his books. He paraphrases it as, Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Christ is the cosmic glue, you might say. There's no part of the universe outside him. He's omnipresent, pervasive. And if this is true, as Lewis believed it was, that means that you can't ever get an angle on God. You can't step into a godless universe from which to look back at and survey this Christ-drenched universe. There is no such position. To step into that vantage point would be to cease to exist, because all things hold together in Christ. But because of this, it's difficult to bring to contemplative consciousness. Lewis says this in his book Miracles, the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, i.e. God, Christ, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be the one that is most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious. And that is exactly how the supernatural has been forgotten. As far as Lewis is concerned, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. God is not just another object in the universe. He is the ground of being in which every part of the universe takes its place, takes its life. You can't step outside it. You can only look along it. And therefore you can easily miss it. God walks everywhere, but incognito, as Lewis puts it in his book on prayer. So you see how this is a theological equivalent of enjoyment consciousness. And remember that Lewis said that the whole Narnia series is about Christ. If you were a writer like C.S. Lewis wanting to write a series of books about Christ, how would you do it? You'd probably do the very obvious thing of putting into your story a Christ character who does Christ-like things. Very obvious, natural, the natural thing to do. But how would you get into your story this aspect of Christ, the cosmic Christ, the omnipresent Christ? That would be a much harder thing to communicate because it would have to be in every part of the story. As well, maybe, as summed up in a Christ-like character. You'd have to have the incarnate Christ and the discarnate Christ. So that's a question worth keeping in mind. This is our third background point, the theological or Christological background point. Now a more literary background point. Lewis wrote an essay called The Kappa Element in Romance. Kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, which means cryptic or hidden. So the title of his paper basically means the hidden element in story. That's what romance means here. Lewis wrote an essay called The Hidden Element in Story. But most people don't know about this because he never published it under this title. He worked it up and published it under a different title, On Stories, where again this hidden aspect of storytelling is his main theme, except he doesn't call it that in that essay. Instead, in that essay, he says this: to be stories at all, stories must be series of events. But it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or a quality. The example Lewis gives in On Stories to communicate what he's trying to talk about is taken from The Last of the Mohicans, Fenimore Cooper. Next year, the speaker at this podium is going to be talking about Native American subjects, isn't he? Is he here right? Anyway, let me steal a little bit of his thunder maybe by talking about Native Americans, because Lewis talks about that story, The Last of the Mohicans, and says, when the hero of the story is half sleeping by his bivouac fire in the woods, while pardon the politically incorrect terminology, while a redskin with a tomahawk is silently creeping up on him from behind, what makes for the essence of the scene, Lewis says, is not the fact that the hero is in danger, but that he's in danger from a guy wielding a tomahawk. If Fenimore Cooper had put a pistol in that character's hand, that would have put the hero into greater danger. But it's not degrees of danger that matter. It's the kind of danger that matters. The whole world within which these kinds of danger might arise. A world very carefully created by Fenimore Cooper out of all sorts of seemingly unimportant little details, like the snowshoes and the canoes and the wigwams, the feathered headdresses, the war paint, the Hiawatha names, the whiskered trousers, the high cheekbones. And yes, the tomahawks, not the pistols. Pistols don't really belong in that world. So what Fenimore Cooper admits us to is the atmosphere of, again, pardon the terminology, the atmosphere of redskinnery. We're admitted to the redskin world. We breathe that oxygen. We know what it's like to move about in that kind of terrain. Bad books like The Three Musketeers, he says, are full of plot and adventure, excitement, but they have no atmosphere. The characters in The Three Musketeers go from London to Paris, and there's no sense that Paris is any different from London. It's just a bucket load of plot. One darn thing after another. You know, it's like those movies that you go to which are full of car chases and explosions and terribly exciting, but you only ever see them once. You don't want to go back to those films. And think about it, actually, in connection with movies. When you're in the movie theatre, you can always tell, can't you, when a movie has lost your interest, because You sink back in your chair and cross your arms, and the frame of the screen becomes visible to you. You ever had that experience? When the movie is engaging your attention, the frame disappears, doesn't it? You sort of pass through the screen and you move about in the imagined world with the characters. You're there with them. Now, of course, the frame of the screen is always there, but by the magic of good filmmaking, it sometimes disappears. And likewise, with the magic of good storytelling, the framing device of the story disappears. You're just there living the story. But because you're living it, by definition, you're not outside it. You're not looking at it with contemplative consciousness. You're enjoying it. So in a sense, it disappears from the top level of your attention. You sink down into it. You get a deeper cognition of it. So we see that this kappa element in romance is, again, a kind of literary version of enjoyment consciousness. We've had a theological version of it. Now we've got a literary version of it. And fifthly and finally, in our background points, one other kind of hiddenness or invisibility. Lewis coined this term, transferred classicism, when he was writing about the techniques that Christian poets would use in the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance even, when they would reach back into their knowledge of classical mythology, and they would take classical gods and goddesses, Zeus, Jupiter, Venus, whoever it may be, and they would transfer those classical gods into their Christian poetry in order to say something about religion, but without being devotional. Paganism, Lewis says, is the religion of poetry, through which the author can express at any moment just so much or so little of his real religion as his art requires, and everyone is in the secret. God often appears in medieval and Renaissance poetry, but incognito, behind a mask, dressed up as Zeus or Jupiter or whoever it may be. And if you were at my lecture this morning, you may remember I was talking about St. Paul preaching to the men of Athens. In the book of Acts, we're told, he quotes pagan poets. God is not far from each one of us, Paul says, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. And he's here quoting pagan poetry about Zeus. Obviously, he's not recommending that the Athenians should start worshipping Zeus, but he's taking classical knowledge of deity and he's transferring it into his presentation of Christian themes. So there in the Bible you have an aspect, an example of transferred classicism. And that's similar to what medieval writers would do later. They would dress up God behind a pagan veil, and everyone was in the secret, Lewis says. Shakespeare, indeed, in his later poems, deliberately did this in order to circumvent the law. There was a law against blasphemy that came in about 1605, preventing playwrights and actors on stage from using the name of God. So when you compare Shakespeare's early plays with his late plays, you suddenly find that in his late plays he's talking much less about God. He now has to now, it's Act of Parliament. He's suddenly talking a lot about Jove, Jupiter, Zeus. He's just saying the same thing but in a different way. He's getting around the law and everybody knew what he was up to. Transferred classicism. So those are our 5 background points, and we're now back where we started at the Narnia Chronicles. So let's just quickly recapitulate our background points. Lewis's capacity for secretiveness, enjoyment consciousness when the beam of light disappears because you're inside it, a theological equivalent of that in this God-drenched universe, a literary equivalent of that in a well-told tale with a pervasive atmosphere, and then hiding God behind a pagan mask. Those are our 5 background points. Now, Narnia. Although Narnia is the thing for which Lewis is best known, he wasn't actually professionally a writer of fiction, and he wasn't professionally a writer of Christian apologetics either. He was professionally an academic. He worked at Oxford for 30 years, finished his career at Cambridge, very distinguished professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. And the biggest book he ever wrote was this: English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. A snappy title, I think you will agree. It was part of this multi-volume series of books called the Oxford History of English Literature. Oh hell, as Lewis summarized it. This was his Oh hell volume. It took him 15 years to write. Now, I asked you earlier to tell me how many of you have read Narnia. Can I do another survey? How many of you have read this book? Nobody. Excellent. Because that proves the point that I'm about to make. When Lewis published this book in 1954, he wrote to a friend and said, "At last I've finished this big academic exercise I've been engaged in for the last decade and a half." And then he adds, this book, was the top tune all those years. And all the other books I published during that period were just its little twiddly bits. Which means that works like the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, Mere Christianity, the early Narnia books, were the little twiddly bits upon this massive intellectual undertaking. This was the top tune. This was the main theme. The other books are just like the little tings on the triangle, the little piccolo flourishes, the excrescences. But we now know Lewis much better for the twiddly bits than we do for the top tune. In a sense, we now get Lewis completely back to front. We mistake the twiddly bits for the main theme. If we want to understand Narnia, if we want to understand Lewis generally, we need to come at him through this kind of work, difficult though it may be. Actually, it's very readable, and I would encourage you to look at it if you're at all interested in the 16th century. It's a very readable book. And if you ever do read it, you'll discover that Lewis opens his discussion with a long treatment of this chap, Nicholas Copernicus, and the revolution in astronomy that Copernicus brought about in the middle of the 16th century when he came up with his theory of the heliocentric universe. Copernicus theorized that we don't actually live in a geocentric cosmos. No, the sun is the center, and we go around the sun. The sun doesn't go around us, as everyone had previously believed. Lewis was interested in this because he wanted to see what effect it had in the literature of the period. Because obviously the kind of cosmos you believe yourself to be living in will have a major effect upon the kinds of literature that you write. Copernicus is kind of a big deal. And this is a theme that Lewis returns to in his last academic book, The Discarded Image. 3 times in The Discarded Image, Lewis encourages his readers to try to imagine themselves back into the pre-Copernican cosmos, where the Earth would have been regarded as static and central, surrounded by a series of ranked heavens or spheres, each sphere with its own planet, and each planet with its own attributes and influences that it would shed upon the Earth and upon people and events, even the metals in Earth's crust. You know this system, but let's just quickly remind ourselves of how it goes. The first of these 7 heavens was that of the moon, then Mercury, then in the 3rd heaven, Venus. Fourthly, the brightest heaven was that of the sun. We must remember that the sun was a planet, just like the moon. Moon and sun are planets at this time. This is the geocentric cosmos. Above the sun was Mars, then Jupiter, and finally in the 7th heaven, Saturn. These are the 7 traditional planets. This is long before astronomers have invented the telescope. These are the objects that can be seen with the naked eye. So there's no Uranus, there's no Neptune, there's no Pluto. Pluto's no longer a planet in any case, is he? now a dwarf planet. And the fate of Pluto actually reminds us that planets come and planets go as new discoveries are made in astronomy. Our model of the cosmos is not fixed and unalterable. It changes according to the state of our knowledge. If you kept going through these planetary spheres, you would eventually come to the sphere of the fixed stars. Planets are wandering stars, and all the other stars are fixed in their constellations. And if you kept going through the fixed stars, you would eventually escape the created order altogether, and you would emerge into the home of God. So this is a slightly more detailed diagram of that cosmos as it was believed to be. And this was hard accepted scientific fact until the 16th century. This was how the universe was. Until Copernicus blew it out of the water, and his theory was later confirmed by Kepler and by Galileo when the telescope was invented in the early 17th century. So this is the discarded image. This is the image of the cosmos that we have thrown out. That's why Lewis calls his book The Discarded Image. Not that we have discarded it in every single respect, because of course it's from these seven heavens that we get the names of the days of the week. What's today? Thursday? So today is Thor's day. Thor is the Norse equivalent of the Roman Jupiter or Jove. Think of Jove's day, Jueves in Spanish, or Jeudi in French. Tomorrow will be the day of Venus, Vendredi in French, Viernes in Spanish, or Freya. Frigg is the Norse equivalent of Venus. So every day of our lives we're referring to this old system, though we tend not to think about it. But Lewis wanted to do more than just retain an awareness in his readers and his students' minds of the connection to the 7 days of the week. He wanted to reacquaint them much more fully with the old cosmos, because that old cosmos was everywhere presupposed in the literature written before the time of Copernicus. There were two major writers who deployed that old cosmology. The first of them, most important perhaps, was Dante in the Divine Comedy. Here's an illustration from an edition of the Divine Comedy. You know how in the Divine Comedy the pilgrim goes up through the seven heavens in his ascent to God's throne. And this picture shows you the seven planetary characters in the order of the days of the week. So there on the left you have the sun in his burning chariot. Then we have the moon in her silvery gown holding her crescent. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Mars' day, Mardi, Martes, Mars with his helmet, his chainmail, associated with warfare and all things militaristic. Then comes Mercury. We know he's Mercury because of the wings on his heels. Mercury was the messenger, swift of foot. Then we have Jupiter, carrying what looks like just a stick over his shoulder in this picture, but it's actually a royal scepter, the staff of kingly office. All things monarchical and regal were associated with Jupiter, symbolically speaking. Then we come to Venus in her green gown. Venus was associated with love, with sexuality, with fertility, creativity. Traces of that aspect of Venus linger in our language when we talk about venerating someone. To venerate is to lovingly respect someone. And you do that by the influence of Venus. When you contract a venereal disease, you're doing something under the influence of Venus, which you probably shouldn't be doing. And then we come to Saturn with his sickle. Saturn cutting people down, bringing about death, disaster, misfortune. Are pictures of Old Father Time with his scythe and his hourglass. They're based on earlier pictures of Saturn, Lewis points out. Saturn and Father Time are the same character, mythologically speaking. So Dante uses this all over the Divine Comedy, this symbolism. So does Chaucer. Here's a page of notes I found in Lewis's handwriting. This is from Lewis's complete Chaucer. And he's making notes about the Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. And Lewis remarks that one of the good things about The Knight's Tale is the way that Chaucer didn't just put the planetary characters into the story as actors in the drama, but wove their influences into the plot, so that the climax of The Knight's Tale happens on a Tuesday, Martes. How appropriate for a story about knights. So Lewis has this academic interest as a literary historian and a literary critic in the old cosmology, but he also responds to it personally. He was quite a keen amateur astronomer. Had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He enjoyed going to the local observatory. He would often point out unusual conjunctions of the planets in the night sky to his friends. He knew his stars. He also had that devotional aspect to the stars that I started out with from Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God, the greatest poem in the book of Psalms, according to Lewis. An academic interest, a personal hobby, a devotional interest, also an imaginative interest. Lewis wrote a trilogy of interplanetary adventures. The Ransom trilogy, the Cosmic trilogy, sometimes called the Space trilogy. The first of these books is set on Mars, a very medieval Mars. The second book is set on Venus, and in the third story, the planetary characters actually come down to Earth to bring about the denouement of the whole tale. Why was Lewis so interested in these old understandings of the planets? Well, he said this: the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, Jupiter? So these are no small claims. It's not just a medieval curiosity as far as Lewis is concerned. No, these have permanent value as spiritual symbols. You can divide the whole of human spirituality up into these 7 categories, if you like. And they're especially worthwhile in his own generation, he says. Why does he say that? Because his own generation was the generation that went through the First World War. Lewis himself had been a teenage officer in the Great War. As a 19-year-old, he arrived in the French trenches, served for about 6 months, before he was blown up in the Battle of Arras in the spring of 1918. The man next to him was obliterated. Lewis was knocked unconscious. He was spattered full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life. 750,000 British servicemen were killed during those 4 years, 1914 to 18. That's why he says of Saturn we know more than enough. We know more than enough of being cut down with the sickle in the prime of life. And Lewis would later describe much of the culture of the 1920s and 30s as Saturnocentric, fixated upon saturnine qualities of death, disaster, cynicism, pessimism. Think of Eliot's The Waste Land and that whole modernist movement towards absurdity and cruelty and meaninglessness. It's an understandable reaction to the great trauma of the First World War, but it was a historical accident as far as Lewis was concerned. It wasn't an eternal truth about the nature of the universe. And a much better way of symbolizing spiritual reality was through the symbolism of Jove, Jupiter, the king. So you see where I'm going with this. When Lewis came to write the Narnia Chronicles, I believe that he used these 7 spiritual symbols again. He'd used them explicitly in the trilogy, but here he uses them implicitly. He takes these symbols and he turns them into stories. He takes these planets and he turns them into plots. But not just the plots, because of course the plot is not the only thing about a well-told tale. It's the atmosphere. It's every part of the tale that matters. So let me explain how I think this works out in practice. We don't have time to go through all 7 books, but let's spend a little bit of time on the first 3. And the first of them is the Jupiter story. Here is the planet Jupiter. And you can just make out in the southeast corner there Jupiter's great red eye, the great red spot of Jupiter, which is a storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter, the diameter of that storm is greater than the diameter of Earth. You could fit the whole of us inside that red circle. Shows you how massive Jupiter is. And here is Jupiter, the king of the gods. Now, I was halfway through my PhD researches, as I said at the start. Then one night in February 2003, I'm just about to turn out my light. I'm reading a poem that Lewis wrote about the planets. And I get to the lines about Jupiter in this planetary poem. And I read this: "Of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven, and good fortune, Jove is master." This is just one of the jovial influences that Jupiter brings about. And 5 words from this little passage jumped off the page at me. Winter past and guilt forgiven. Winter past and guilt forgiven. That's very like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is all about the passing of winter and the forgiving of guilt. Do you remember how the White Witch has made it always winter but never Christmas? Her kingdom of ice and snow is defeated, and Edmund's guilt is forgiven. Edmund, the traitor who's betrayed his brother and his sisters, his guilt is forgiven. So I look a bit more closely at these lines about Jupiter, and a great deal of the imagery in the poem links up with imagery in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Principally kingliness. We've already seen how Jupiter is above all things the king. And think about The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, how Aslan is introduced in that first tale. The children don't know who he is in that book. He's a complete stranger. They think he might just be a regular man, but they're told, no, he's not a man, he's the king of the wood. He's not safe, but he's good. He's the king. He's later described as royal and solemn. He's got a royal pavilion, a royal standard, all these royal accoutrements. And he is not the only royal character in the story, because the children too become kings and queens as the story progresses. That is envisioned in the very first entry they make into the wardrobe. You recall they put on the fur coats they find in the wardrobe, and we're told the coats looked more like royal robes than coats when they put them on. That's an indication of where the story is going to progress. It's going to climax in the grand coronation scene at the castle of Cair Paravel, where they're going to be hailed and enthroned and crowned and sceptered. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. The story is really a clash of kingship between Edmund and Peter. Edmund, you remember, has been ensnared by the White Witch. We always tend to recall the Turkish delight, don't we? That sort of sticks in the mind for some reason. But the Turkish delight is really only the bait on the hook. What reels Edmund in is the prospect of becoming, first of all, a prince and later on the king, so that he can pay Peter back for being so beastly to him. The tale is really a terrible case of sibling rivalry. Who's going to be king? Well, Edmund hopes that he'll become king under the White Witch after she's gone. But Peter is taken by Aslan, and he's shown the castle and the 4 thrones. And Aslan says to him, you, Peter, will be high king over all the rest. Over all the rest, including Edmund. Edmund will indeed become a king on the right side, but only after Aslan has demonstrated true kingship in his sacrifice for Edmund's sake. And so we come to the heart of the book, Aslan's death on the stone table and his resurrection. And everyone immediately sort of throws up their hands and says, oh, this is just a nice little Sunday school lesson, isn't it? This is a biblical parallel. This is Lewis teaching his children about Jesus' death on the cross. That's got nothing to do with Jupiter. It's got nothing to do with anything. It's just part of his overt moralizing. In the same year that Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he wrote another book on the poetry of his great friend Charles Williams. Williams was a member of the Inklings, like Tolkien and Lewis. And in that book, Lewis says this. When Charles Williams writes of Jupiter's red-pierced planet, he assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another archetype of the divine king wounded on Calvary. So this shows us that Lewis very explicitly connects the sacrifice of Christ on the cross with Jupiter symbolism. That's why Aslan dies on the stone table in that first story. It's part of the total jovial atmosphere which the book is designed to communicate. Here's a medieval woodcut showing you Jupiter enthroned in the heavens, and down on earth are the people who exhibit his influence. So there on the right you have a man kneeling for a coronation. In the middle ground on the left you can see another figure kneeling for judgment before a judge. Is his guilt going to be forgiven or not? And in the background you can maybe just make out horses and hounds, and they're going to be off hunting the white stag, the white hart, which was the noblest quarry that kings and queens would hunt for in medieval romances. We've already talked about the coronation, the judgment. Think of the final chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's called The Hunting of the White Stag. It's for these reasons and for many others that I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is very deliberately constructed out of jovial symbolism. Lewis takes this spiritual symbol and he uses it to, first of all, create a kappa element, a pervasive atmosphere or flavour to the whole story. Not just plot he's interested in, but feeling, weather, that magic of good storytelling. And he also does it for theological reasons, because the whole Narnia series is about Christ, but Christ is not just a singular historical figure, he's the cosmic Christ as well. And the jovial symbolism allows Lewis to get in both things at once. Aslan is the king, but in a generally monarchical story. Aslan is the one who sums up the jovial spirit in his own personality, but you see it in every part of the story. The passing of winter, the coming of spring, the forgiving of guilt, even the appearance of Father Christmas, who is the jovial personality par excellence in our otherwise very saturnine 20th century, as it then was for Lewis. We don't have time to go into that in any more depth. Let's quickly move on to Prince Caspian to see how it works out with respect to Mars. This is the Marshall story, I believe, because Prince Caspian is a war story, a story of the Great War of Deliverance, as it's later called. And military events are everywhere in this story, battles and single combat, and if you saw the recent movie version, you won't have missed those martial elements. They really went to town on the battles in the recent feature film. But you might say there are battles in lots of the Narnia books. So what makes this a specifically martial story? Well, it's partly the sheer centrality of those battles. They are everywhere. It's partly that the very word martial appears a couple of times in the story. But what clinches it is something that has nothing to do with battles at all, but has everything to do with trees. You see the trees on the cover here. You remember how Lucy in the story tries to wake the trees. The trees come to the battle at the end of the book. Why? Why all these trees? I had no knowledge of this until I began my researches, but Mars, according to Roman mythology, was not always and only the god of war. He was originally a vegetation deity called Mars Silvanus, associated with trees and forests. Here's a mural at Pompeii showing you Mars in his twin capacities. Yes, he's the god of war. He's got his shield, his helmet, his spear, but he's standing against this backdrop of burgeoning vegetation. The month of March is sacred to Mars, really in both these capacities, because in the month of March, the trees are coming back to life after winter, and also the weather is getting good enough for armies to march off to battle. So in Prince Caspian, here's an image from Prince Caspian. Lewis very cleverly gets in both aspects of the martial influence at once. You see them here in this single picture. We have the single combat in the foreground, and it's overseen by the dryads, the hamadryads, and the sylvans. Sylvans appear in Prince Caspian, but in no other Narnia book, because the whole story is dedicated to evoking the martial spirit. And again, Aslan sums it up in his own person. He gives the great war cry, summoning everyone to the final battle, but he's also the one in whose presence the trees begin to move and come alive. Lucy tries to wake them, but she can't unless Aslan's present with her. And the children, again, grow up into this spirit that Aslan manifests. The boys harden into knights. The girls romp in the bacchanalian revelry with the swaying trees, the growing vines. Even seemingly unimportant details like that little chess piece that's discovered at the start of the tale. What is that chess piece? Do you remember? Is it a bishop? Is it a pawn? Is it a king? It's a knight, a chess knight, with a little red ruby eye. Because knighthood, gallantry, chivalry, everything martial is what the entire story is designed to embody and express. The Dawn Treader, more briefly now, is the sun story. You could really guess this from the title of the book alone, because this is a story about a journey towards the dawn, the place of the rising sun. And when the children encounter Aslan at the eastern edge of the world, he scatters light from his mane. They encounter him on that island with the magic pool that turns things to gold. Gold, of course, was the sun's metal. And as soon as they discover they've got this gold pool, they begin to squabble about who's going to take ownership of this island. And then remember, they're suddenly shamed into silence by the appearance of Aslan on the hillside, and we're told that he's shining as if in bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in. Gold imagery of illumination and enlightenment, is everywhere in this story. But again, what clinches it is something which I had no knowledge of until I began exploring. And that is a theme connected with dragons. The ship itself is shaped like a dragon. Remember, Eustace is turned into a dragon. They meet the great sea serpent. There are lots of other dragons and snakes and serpents in the tale. Why all these snakes and serpents? At first blush, you might say, oh, it's just Lewis throwing things together at random. No, no, no. It's got everything to do with solar symbolism, because in Greek mythology, the god of light, Apollo, was famously a slayer of dragons. Here is Apollo Sauroctonus, the lizard slayer, the dragon slayer. He's looking at that miniature dragon, that lizard, and he's killing it with the beams from his eyes. If you know your Homer's hymn to Apollo, you'll remember a famous episode in which Apollo does just this. So think back to the Dawn Treader. Here's a still from the recent film version. So this is Eustace's eyeball after he's been turned into a dragon. And in the reflection in his eyeball, you can just make out the approaching figure of Aslan. Aslan is going to come and rip off the dragon skin. He's going to kill the dragon that Eustace has become and turn him back into a boy again. Aslan is the true Apollo Sauroctonus. He's the true sun of this world. He's, you might say in biblical terminology, he is the light of the world. Lewis could have got at all this symbolism straight through biblical material. I am the light of the world, Christ says. Be a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Put on the whole armor of God for Mars. For Jupiter, think of God being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So all of this imagery Lewis could have got straight from the biblical material, but he goes a long way round through classical mythology and medieval cosmology in order to enrich his biblical theology as he goes. It's one of the reasons, I think, why the series has become so popular, because there's so much going on. let me just very quickly summarize the remaining 4 books. The Silver Chair is the moon story. Here is the moon goddess driving her chariot across the heavens. The Horse and His Boy is the Mercury story, in which Aslan is swift of foot, and here is Mercury with wings on his heels and wings on his cap, an image from Oxford that Lewis would have passed many times. The Magician's Nephew is the Venus story, the creative story about motherliness and laughter and life-giving apples taken from western gardens and beautiful women and all creative and gorgeous, beautiful, sweet things. And The Last Battle, of course, is the Saturn story, because in this book all the characters who are alive at the start of the tale are dead by the end of it. And who is it that brings Narnia to an end? Father Time, with his scythe and his hourglass. Father Time is Saturn. And actually I turned up a typescript of the Narnia books in which Lewis had originally called Father Time the god Saturn. It's there in the typescript. But by the time Lewis came to publish Narnia, he thought, that's too obvious. So he changed it to Old Father Time, banking on us not knowing the connection between Father Time and Saturn. So here is Lewis. If this theory is correct, why would Lewis have done it, and why does it matter? Well, very quickly, why does it matter? Because it shows us these books are not a hodgepodge. They're not a mishmash. They're actually constructed with minute care, with minuscule attention to detail. They're very sophisticated works, actually, imaginatively speaking. When Lewis had published 5 of the books, he wrote to a friend and said, I'm still working on the remaining 2 Chronicles, and they're taking all my imagination. That's a heck of a lot of imagination. He didn't just dash these books off. I mean, if he had dashed them off, and yet they still became these classic works, that itself is so improbable as to demand explanation. They've become classics because Lewis wrote them very, very, very skillfully and carefully. So that's why it matters, I think, that we just give Lewis the honour that is his due. And why would he have done this? Well, I think 2 reasons, which we've touched upon a couple of times already. We have the literary reason, the kappa element in romance, the importance of giving a well-told tale a pervasive atmosphere and flavour, so that the whole world conspires to conjure an atmosphere. That's the literary reason. And the theological reason, again, we've touched on several times, that if the stories are going to be about Christ, then they need to be about Christ in a holistic and intelligently biblical way. Not just with an obvious Christ character who does Christ-like stuff, but stories in which Christ is present in 2 modes at once, discarnate and incarnate, simultaneously, and in which the children, as they relate to the Christ character, can grow up into his stature. They can take on those spiritual qualities of kingship and knighthood and illumination and language and life and all the other qualities that these 7 spiritual symbols communicate. But I think it's very interesting that Lewis should have kept it secret. He was content for the books to be dismissed as a hodgepodge. That shows great humility. But it also, I think, is a very interesting apologetic strategy. Because Lewis is the author of this world. Think of it in connection with the real world. How often do we throw up our hands and say, nobody's in charge, when we see terrible accidents happen, disasters, innocent people suffering? We say, God, where are you? How can this possibly make sense? And yet Lewis believed that, no, indeed, God is working his purposes out. There is a divine author. He knows what he's trying to achieve through all these apparently disparate and incompatible elements, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. At any rate, that's what I think, and I'll be interested to know what you make of it. Thank you.
Smart.
I know that we have a commitment to be completed by 9 o'clock, but that allows us a few minutes for you to ask some questions. And with the help of the student ambassadors who will take this microphone around to entertain your questions, I will be Father Time, and you will ask some questions. So let's go ahead and prepare some things you'd like to ask our guest, Professor Michael Ward.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for speaking. I just was wondering, what do you make of the fact that in the Chronicle of Narnia books, that each time the children go to Narnia, they have to leave the real world, this war-torn Britain, in order to enter this fantasy land? How does that figure into your theory? It just seems, as far as Christ being incarnate and discarnate, it's interesting that they have to in some way leave reality.
Yeah, I think that's really just a framing device. The episodes set at the start and at the finish in England are very brief. I don't think they themselves participate in the symbolic atmosphere that he's trying to create. At any rate, they don't in the first few examples. Lewis said in a letter to someone that he thought he got better at the books as he went on. And so it's interesting, actually, that by the time of the fourth book, Silver Chair, it is actually the case that the episodes set in England do also help conspire to conjure the lunar atmosphere in that book. So the opening of the Silver Chair is very, very wet. You may have noticed that. Lots of rain and wet grass and drips falling off laurel trees and things like that. And even a headmistress of the school who's a lunatic. So I think by the time of the fourth book, Lewis had begun to sort of insert the symbolism even into the English episodes, but not in the first few. Because it's worth pointing out that this scheme was not envisioned from the start. He didn't have all 7 books mapped out in advance. He wanted at the start to write one book, the Jupiter book, because Jupiter was his favorite planet, the one that he thought we needed to be reminded of in this Saturnine age. He even jokingly said that he himself had been born under Jupiter. And so he writes The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with just that one story in mind. But then having done that, he thinks, oh, that was good fun, and he writes a second, a third, a fourth, and eventually he decides to do all 7. But it was an incremental design in that sense. So that's another reason why I think he got better as the series went on, that he saw more and more opportunities that this scheme allowed him. And it's worth pointing out also that he had written 4 of the books actually before the first was even published. So he did have a chance to go back and make minor adjustments if he needed them for the sake of the series as it began to grow. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Anybody else? There's a question over here. Yes, ma'am.
In the 7th book, I know I've read the series too many times. It's kind of embarrassing. In the 7th one, I know there's a lot of discussion on Aslan's part of himself versus the other crow god that existed in the other nations of Narnia. And I was wondering if that had any impact on your ideology of C.S. Lewis's theology, of just more of the interpretation of myth and order of God in and of itself. Does that make any sense? It was a little rambly.
Possibly. You're asking about his understanding of the relationship between Christianity and other religions, are you?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that there is this sort of antichrist figure in the last battle. Shift, the ape. An early church father, Tertullian, talks about how the devil was an ape from the first. The devil always imitates God, tries to convince you, looks very like God. Like, the devil can appear as an angel of light. And the ape dresses up in the lion, gets the donkey to dress up in the lion skin to confuse the Narnians. Is that Aslan? You can only see him at night. He looks quite like a lion. plausible, and they get deceived. So that's Lewis's attempt to depict the Antichrist of the book of Revelation, I think. But it's worth pointing out that Lewis is not there utterly dismissing, deriding those who get misled by false or by other religions, because there's that character called Emeth, who's a Calamine soldier who spent his whole life worshipping Tash, this Calamine god, who seems to be, on the face of it, opposed to everything Aslan stands for. And yet Emeth gets welcomed into the heavenly Narnia at the end of the tale, which causes lots of very conservative-minded Christians conniptions. They think, oh, Lewis is suddenly gone all soft and liberal, he's flirting with universalism. But of course he's not flirting with universalism. There are plenty of depictions of people who aren't welcomed into that heavenly Narnia. They choose their way, and they go into Aslan's shadow and are not seen again. But Emeth is welcomed into heavenly Narnia because he's worshipped Aslan without knowing it, basically. That's what it comes down to. Aslan has saved him even without his recognition of the fact. And so that's not universalism, that's inclusivism. God can include in salvation people who, on the face of it, are outside the Christian religion in this life. It's a little bit like the flip side of that dominical utterance, where Christ says, "Not all those who call me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven." So there are people on this earth who look like Christians, think they're Christians maybe, but aren't. So maybe there are people who think they are not Christian, but are. At any rate, that's what he's playing with imaginatively in that episode. And it's worth noting actually that Emeth, the name itself of that character, Emeth is a Hebrew word meaning fidelity, permanence, truth. So Emeth is a true son of Aslan, even though he doesn't realize it. And it's worth noting also that Emeth is a seventh son. King Tyrion is seventh in descent from Caspian, we're told. How appropriate for the seventh planet, the last planet, old and ugly, and yet it has its own beauties too. Thank you for your question. Down here.
Dr. Ward, I thank you again for coming to speak to us. For me, I've really enjoyed hearing your theory, and I think it's really opened things up for my understanding of the Narnia narrative. I'm curious, over the years since you've kind of developed your theory of Lewis's, the way that he tells the story, what kind of response and feedback that you've received from other colleagues or people that have heard the theory? I'm curious how it's been received.
Thank you. I'm delighted to say that it's been received very well indeed. I was hoping for a good response because I think it's true, To put it bluntly. It's not just another attempt to squeeze the books into a pre-imagined grid. I had tried that with the Shakespeare theory. I know what that's like. I know what that kind of literary criticism is like, what it feels like from the inside. You're sort of jemmying the books into this grid of your own devising. But with this idea, first of all, I wasn't even looking for it. It just fell into my lap. And as soon as it arrived in my lap, it just sort of lit up. So many things about the books, about the place of the Chronicles in Lewis's other writings. It has such explanatory power that it has to be true, I think, even though it does introduce certain new problems, like the fact that he didn't tell anybody about it. And one or two people, I think, just can't get over that. They think Lewis must have told somebody. But that's why I start out with my point about his capacity for secretiveness. If he didn't tell Tolkien that he'd got married, why would he have told Tolkien about this plan? And in any case, the whole point of this plan is that it is to be enjoyed when you read, not to be contemplated as you read. So Lewis couldn't have told people about it, even if he'd wanted to. If he'd told them, it would have frustrated the very thing he was trying to achieve. I can explain it as a literary critic coming afterwards, but Lewis as the author couldn't do that. You can't be both author and critic at the same time. So anyway, I think it's got great explanatory power, and I'm very pleased to say that 98% of Lewis scholars, Lewis critics, basically accept it. And don't just accept it grudgingly, they say, of course! How did we miss this all this time? It's so obvious once you see it. So the general response has been delightfully positive, and I mean, in a sense, I don't take any particular sort of ownership of this idea. I feel much more like a steward of it. It just happened to come to me first, but someone was going to notice this eventually. It just happened to be me, and that's irrelevant. The point is that it's now out there in the public domain, and make of it what you will. I don't particularly mind whether you agree with me or not. I myself find it utterly persuasive and beautiful, and actually very moving in many different ways. There's so much going on in these books. They are works of genius, I think. That's part of the reason why they have become such classics. And the more you push into them, the more you see Lewis's brilliance. But there are many details that I didn't even include in Planet Narnia, which I've discovered more recently. Everywhere you look, it rings true. He must have had such fun doing this. And I'm pleased to say that most of the response has caught that fun and rejoiced in this discovery. Thank you. Anybody else?
We have time for one more question, folks.
One more question. There's a chap over here.
Yes, thanks very much for a really amazing lecture. My question is about what you think are the limits of your theory. That is, what is it that you think your theory of the Chronicles of Narnia explains? And is there something important that you think maybe it doesn't explain? And what I mean by that is the sequence of planets, the sequence of weekdays, seems to explain a lot of the setting, the color, the characterology, so to speak, the order in which these things appear in the books, the number of books. Do you think that it also explains what, in one of the earlier quotes, you talked about the plot, right? The K in the stories, but do you think your theory also explains the story that runs through all 7 books?
Well, I think in one sense, yes, in that the overarching theme is very much like Dante's Paradiso. Lewis loved the Paradiso of Dante's Divine Comedy. He regarded it as the highest point that poetry had ever reached. And he also said that Dante was the only poet of the Middle Ages, really, who infused that old pre-Copernican cosmos with high religious ardor. And I think Lewis is trying to do a similar sort of thing in his own way. So that would explain sort of the overarching trajectory behind the whole sequence. I'm not quite sure what else you're asking. Can you very briefly say again?
I wonder, in other words, it seems to explain much about the setting, the colors, the number of chapters, why we see certain motifs, why we see them in that order. But is there something that interconnects the sequence of deities and the days of the week that also maps onto the unfolding of the story? We saw in that quotation, stories are a series of events that make out a plot, and the essence of them is something that is not a sequence of events.
Yes. Well,
any of that explained by your theory?
Well, only in that the essence of the overarching sequence is mysterious purpose which you cannot contemplate. I think that might be the best way of summarizing it. There is a mysterious, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will, to quote Shakespeare. That the children don't know that they are, as it were, participating in a jovial world and in a martial world any more than we do as readers. That is to say, we don't know it with our contemplative consciousness. They know it, and we know it as readers, through enjoyment consciousness. That, I think, is probably the undergirding or the overarching purpose behind the whole sequence. And that's because Lewis, I think, was making a very concerted attempt through much of his writings to subvert an awareness of God which he thought was mistaken. The awareness that God is somehow just another being in the universe that we can look at and learn and study. That's not actually that's not a classically Christian understanding of God. God is not a being in the universe. He's the ground of being in which all created things consist, subsist. Therefore, we have to think of God in a unique category. We can't get outside him. We can't look at God from the outside and study him like we might study the railway timetable or the periodic table of elements. You can't know God like that. Not really. And insofar as you try to know God like that, you are reducing God to religious studies as opposed to Christian theology. Christian theology involves a relationship, a personal mode of knowing, which is, in one sense, less clear than the looking at, but in another sense is so much deeper because it involves the whole person. It involves not just skimming off the top of your intellect, but your whole being, emotions, imagination, memory, your very body. That's how you come to know God. And so in Reflections on the Psalms, Lewis's book on the Psalms, he says, coming to know God is not so much like learning a subject as it is like breathing an atmosphere. So it's highly significant, I think, that this breathing of an atmosphere is his description for knowledge of God. And what does he give us in Narnia? 7 different atmospheres, 7 different kinds of oxygen that you breathe in. And in the process of breathing in, you come to know Aslan. So that, I think, is probably the answer to your question.
Please join me in thanking